in the aftermath of Dricus Duplessis versus Israel Adesanya, where, of course, Duplessis finished the fight by submission, rear naked choke, fourth round. It went, in the end, the way that I predicted, with Duplessis being the hungrier fighter, being the guy on top of his game right now, taking the fight being too much for Israel. But let's not lose what actually happened in the course of the fight. And this was not a fight that was clearly Duplessis from round 1 to round 4, till the point where Duplessis won it. This was a fight which could have very easily gone either way. It was a back-and-forth battle. There were moments, certainly in the middle rounds, maybe even the beginning of the fourth round, where Israel was landing certain shots, and Duplessis had that typical tired look, but you had a guy in Israel standing across from him who knows how to capitalize when you have a tired opponent. And he was landing uppercuts and body work with extreme success. And it certainly seemed like there was going to be a point where Israel could land just the one shot that changes the entire complexion drastically into Israel's own favor and wins this fight either by knockout, or Israel could have won rounds 4 and 5 and ended up as the victor of the fight straight out, winning 3, 4, and 5. Certainly possible. Also, round 1 was a bit of a toss-up. I know that there were many dissenting scorecards, many varying scorecards from media members and from fans alike. This was not a fight that was a Duplessis rout. This was not a fight where, Duplessis dominated Adesanya. That didn't happen. Israel's performance was very impressive, despite the fact that he lost. And while that is true, in the end of the day, all the reasons why Duplessis won, why we thought Duplessis would win, were the reasons why he won. He was the hungrier fighter. He said in the press conferences before the fight that he was going to create opportunities, whereas Israel, as he's been throughout his entire career, has been more one to take advantage of the opportunity if it presents itself, like he did against Whitaker and against Costa, against fighters who really led the dance. But there was no wide gap in skill sets here. Each round was swinging in the balance of one good shot. One good shot could have changed the complexion of any of those rounds. Something to note about Duplessis is that he's one of the most realistic fighters. Like, he knows where he's at. He has a very good grasp of who he is, what he does well, and he explains himself clearly and accurately both before and after the fight. And he knows what he lacks in technique, he makes up for in mentality and willingness to lay himself out for the sake of a victory and never, ever give up, no matter how tired he gets. What's interesting is that if you reversed the roles here and you, instead of Israel being the dominant champion who then loses and then comes back and tries to regain his title, instead say that was Duplessis. Let's say Duplessis was the 35-year-old and Israel was the 30-year-old and Israel is the guy coming up who's hungry. I would see this going the other way. If you reverse this, and Israel is on the rise, and Duplessis is the guy at the top, and Israel had his sights set on taking the belt from Duplessis, preparing for his style and knowing what he had to do to come in and take him out, I think we would have seen a different result. I think Israel would have won the fight. But it wasn't like that. This wasn't Israel coming in preparing for Robert Whitaker. This was Duplessis coming in preparing for the 35-year-old Israel. And Duplessis has all the hunger. He has the hunger that Kamaru Usman had at 170 pounds when he first came up and totally dominated Tyron Woodley. And then eventually he lost a little bit of that. And although he's still very good, he lost some of that. And Israel's the same way. And the flaws that Israel has are becoming more pronounced the older Israel gets. Namely, where Israel's knock, his critique against him was that he didn't always go for it. He would stand back and wait for the opportunity to show itself, and then he would try to capitalize on it, which, like we just mentioned, worked really well when he fought Whitaker and fought Costa, and it even worked very well when he fought Brunson. because each of those fighters had holes in their game that they would present that Israel could capitalize on with the counter shots. But when he fought Romero, it wasn't really like that because Israel was waiting and Romero was waiting. Both of them were waiting for the other one to go, and that just made it a really boring, non-entertaining fight. And when he fought against Sean Strickland, Strickland is a guy who sort of presses with a point fighting style, but he's not really one to expose himself with powerful punches, putting himself out there to be hit in the process, which is what Israel capitalizes on. And the same thing with when Israel fought Anderson Silva. Anderson was also a guy who, for the most part, except for maybe when he fought Forrest Griffin, he was a guy who didn't try to create opportunities. He was a guy who took the opportunities that came. He was slick defensively, and then he capitalized with incredible counter shots, similar to what Israel did in a way. And that was why when they fought each other, it was an okay fight. It had some good moments in it. It was a little bit of the changing of the guard. It had that cool factor to it of the best of this era and potentially the best of the upcoming era. But when he went against someone who was also looking for the counter, it didn't really work out for him. And here, it seems like there were moments in the fight where Israel had du Plessis on the feet. He stuffed a takedown. He had him out at range. Du Plessis' mouth was open, he was breathing heavy, and he was lunging forward with shots. Israel would land some good body shots. He would land a good uppercut. And it's like, Israel, you just need to go for it right now. There was a moment in round 2. There was a moment in round 3. You need to go for it right now. And he didn't have the hunger. Whereas du Plessis, you could tell when the opportunity presented himself, he pounced on it. Like a tiger going for a piece of meat. He pounced on it. And the second that he finished the fight, his hands shot up in victory. He knew what he did immediately. He was going for the victory the entire time. He was going for the win within regulation, not on the scorecards, and that was apparent. And du Plessis said that before the fight. He said it after the fight, and it was clear as day if you watched the fight. So these flaws, this flaw in Israel, where Israel still has the talent and the skill, he's just lacking a little bit of that hunger that du Plessis has. Du Plessis, who's building his legacy right now. Israel already kind of had it, and what's keeping him there? After all these kickboxing and all of these UFC fights, what's keeping him there? On one hand, it's very impressive that despite the fact that Israel seemed super emotional in the build-up to the fight and he cried at the press conference, that he was still able to throw a great fight out there and still perform to a very high level. He was just lacking that instinct, the killer instinct to put him away, something which he's lacked at points in his career, and now it's only going to get worse. But there was a path to Israel winning this fight. Du Plessis, the guy who's eventually going to beat du Plessis, is probably not going to be an incredible wrestler like Chimaev. It's probably not going to be someone who is an incredible jiu-jitsu fighter, because du Plessis' wrestling is good enough. His jiu-jitsu is good enough. His cardio, although he seems to always get tired in fights, always holds up. So who's going to beat du Plessis? Who's going to beat the awkward striking style? It's going to be someone who has incredibly precise striking and someone who can stuff the takedown. Basically, it's going to be a younger version of Israel Adesanya. That's the style that's going to beat du Plessis one day. So the fact that Israel had the style and still wasn't able to do it just shows that not only do you need the right style to beat du Plessis, but you also need the right time. And Israel may have had the right style, but it was the wrong time. Had you gone back into the past, Israel could have won this fight. And the older Israel gets, the more pronounced the lack of finishing is going to be. And it's why he soared against Whitaker and Costa, but then, against Romero Silva and even Jan Blachowicz. Blachowicz was waiting. Blachowicz was biting on all of the feints of Israel. He was being defensively sound, but he wasn't recklessly rushing in on Israel. And when guys didn't come after Israel, this was sort of the way it went, and it's only getting worse now, as Israel's presented with opportunities that he needs to take advantage of to win, and he's not doing it. Now, if you look to the future, there are very few fights that really make sense for Israel right now. In Strickland, he already just fought him and he got destroyed. It's a horrible matchup for Israel. He just got submitted by Duplessis. Pretty dominant, ending of the fight. There's not going to be much of an appetite for a rematch there. They had bad blood and now they sorted it out. So why would he want to... The Strickland makes no sense for Israel. At least it makes no sense for Strickland. Duplessis doesn't really make any sense in a rematch. And Israel already beat Robert Whittaker twice. Whittaker would want to fight Israel again just to prove that he could beat him. And every time that Israel fights Whittaker, a little bit of that gap closes to the point where Whittaker's going to win if they keep fighting. If they fight another... Whittaker will either win on the next one or he'll win on the one after that. Eventually, Whittaker will win against Israel. He's closing the gap more and more. It makes no sense for Israel to take that fight. Israel's motivation gets less and less and less, and Whittaker's motivation gets more and more and more. The only potential fight for Adesanya is maybe Alex Pereira, who's up at 205, but Israel already said that he feels the best he's ever felt at 185 physically, and he doesn't want to go up again. He doesn't want to face Jan again. He's happy with Jan. Jan praised him. Jan wished him good luck before the fight, so he doesn't want to go up to 205. He's staying at 185. Who else is Israel potentially going to fight? He's not going to fight someone way down the rankings, right? Now you have Kamaru Usman. Usman fought at 185 against Chimaev and debatably lost that fight. But Usman's never going to fight Israel. They're the Africans, this and that. They have good blood with each other. They're not going to fight each other. Chimaev is really perhaps the only good potential fight. He's really the only one. And what's going to happen? So Chimaev is supposed to fight Whittaker. Let's say that they actually both make it to the fight this time. Let's say that Chimaev loses. Then I think you have a really good opportunity to make Chimaev versus Israel. Meaning Whittaker would then get the rematch. He would get up there and Whittaker would get to either fight Strickland or he would get to fight for the title again in a rematch against Duplessis. But then that would free up Israel and Chimaev, both coming off of losses, to fight each other. And it would be a great stylistic matchup of the incredible wrestler with first round cardio against the precision striker who defends takedowns. It would be great. Let's say Chimaev beats Whittaker, though. If Chimaev beats Whittaker, well, Chimaev is probably going to want to fight for the title at that point. So then Chimaev is going to have to fight Duplessis. And then, again, if Chimaev loses, yeah, you can make the fight against Israel. But if Chimaev wins, I guess you could also have a case to give Israel another title shot against Chimaev, but you're just going to be waiting a little bit because it depends on what happens here with Chimaev versus Whittaker. I think a loss for Chimaev is then the building block to Chimaev versus Adesanya. But either way, Adesanya is going to be waiting for a little while, and frankly, I don't know if waiting is really good for him at this point. I don't even know if waiting was the right move for Adesanya in general from the last fight. I mean, Adesanya was an active guy. I don't know that the time off really did too much for him. I don't know if that's a popular opinion, but what's going to happen if Israel takes more time off? Like, how does that benefit him in any way? He looks good now. Who's to say he's going to look as good in another year? He may as well fight every 3 months if he feels good. If he feels like he's in top shape, he's not the biggest weight cutter. Like, maybe he should just keep fighting. Maybe activity is good for him. I know that he lost against Sean Strickland, but that was just one fight. I mean, he fought 1,000,000 times. He lost to Pereira, he came back and he beat Pereira. Like, who's to say, who can look at the activity of Israel and determine what was good and what was bad? Almost everything was good, sort of. I mean, well, now if you look at he's lost fights against 4 different guys, so his resume has definitely got cracked a little bit because he lost the fight to Jan. A fight where maybe if he tactically fought a drop differently, he could have won. He lost to Jan. He lost to Pereira, then came back and beat Pereira. If he would have retired then, that probably would have been a great spot. If Israel would have retired before fighting Jan, he would have basically flown off into the sunset with like 8, 9, or 10 UFC victories in a row, similar to Khabib, and he would have just retired and been hailed as like one of the greatest ever. Or if Israel lost to Jan and then ended up losing to... Then came back, he won a few fights, then lost to Pereira, and then came back and beat Pereira, that would have been another great time to retire, because then really the only real loss that he would have had on his resume would have been that loss at 205 to Jan, because the loss that he had to Pereira, he avenged. That would have been another great time to retire. Now things look a little bit worse because then he came back and he lost to Strickland, and now he lost to Duplessis. So now he's lost fights to Jan Blachowicz. He lost to Blachowicz, Strickland, Duplessis, and Pereira. And yes, he did avenge the loss against Pereira, but at this point, it's too many losses. Unless he goes back and defends and avenges the loss against Jan and avenges it against Duplessis and Strickland, or at least 3 out of the 4. These are losses. There's so many losses now that it's going to stand. He has 4 losses. Khabib retired with no losses in the UFC. It's just it's hard to even see but are they going to make an Israel versus Bo Nickel fight? I've seen some people talk about that. I mean, it's a pretty wild fight, but I don't see why they would make the Bo Nickel fight before they make a Chimaev fight. Chimaev is actually at the top of the division, and he has that wrestling game. Bo Nickel has that wrestling game, but he's much lower down the division. He has ways to go before you should really be fighting Israel Adesanya. And who's to say that the UFC would just immediately make that matchup and risk this prospect of Bo Nickel getting starched by Israel and never being the same? Like, there's no saying that the UFC would want to do that. So ultimately, I think that the best you can hope for Israel is Chimaev loses to Whitaker, and then Chimaev fights Israel off a loss, and Israel is off this loss, and that's really maybe the best way to go, unless there's just some quick matchup out there that Israel can just take a fight and get some victories before he'll be unable to get victories anymore. On the other hand, you have Duplessis. He's got more to look forward to because a rematch against Strickland makes sense. Their first fight was pretty close. Some people say Strickland won. I thought Duplessis won. But you can redo that one. Chimaev is a great fight as well if Chimaev beats Whitaker. You know, Whitaker, I don't think he has much to prove in the fight against Whitaker again, but he could fight Whitaker again if Whitaker beats Chimaev. And then if Usman wanted to come back up and get a shot at the 185 belt, Duplessis and him would probably go at it with each other, and he would accept that challenge. I know the African thing, but Duplessis just fought another guy who was born in Africa, so why wouldn't he fight Usman? So there's a lot of options for Duplessis right now. Duplessis is a big guy. He could also potentially go up. He says eventually he could go up and fight Pereira. I don't know if that's a good idea for him to move up. I think Duplessis kind of has 185 is perfect for him. He's big, he's strong, and he needs those things because technically he's a little bit deficient. He's a little bit lacking. So the physical gifts that he has, the burst, the ability to take a shot, the mentality, all of that is key for him. And him being a bigger 185er is key for him. Super, super important. So there you have what we could potentially see coming from Israel. The only super interesting fight for him coming up right now would potentially be a Chimaev fight. And then for Duplessis, you have a few more options on the table. This is the Straight Up Fight Network.